Good morning and good afternoon, Good afternoon and welcome to another edition of COVID Calls. Today's edition was meant to have Foreign Affairs Minister Evarist Bartolo. We're meant to do this program in the morning and then he postponed it to this afternoon. He had to cancel once again, so that's the third cancellation so far. He's telling me that we should be able to do a program tomorrow. So we hope to get the opportunity to question Mr. Bartolo in terms of the government decisions on what's going on in the Mediterranean Sea. But today we also have two other guests who are scheduled to be on the program as well to discuss both this crisis and some other issues related to COVID-19, both in terms of civil society and the church. So my two guests today are Manuel Delia from Repubblica and Fr Brendan Gatt from the church. Thank you very much for being with us. Can you hear me, both of you?
Yes, thank you.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to start with Manuel Delia for now, and then we'll bring you on the show a bit later, Fr Brendan. Manuel, let's start off with what's happened this week. So we know that at least 5 migrants were found dead, having died of hunger and dehydration or exhaustion in the high seas, and another 7 presumed dead, presumed drowned as well, and 50 migrants as well taken back to Libya. This all happened after Malta sort of refused to rescue these migrants in who were in danger in Maltese waters. Repubblica has reacted quite strongly to this situation. In a nutshell, tell us what you've done.
Yes, we reacted quite strongly because I don't think there's anything worse than loss of life, and therefore we think that our reaction is more than proportionate. We have filed a judicial protest in court, warning cabinet ministers that their decision has the consequence, at the time having the consequence, because we didn't know people died, of killing people, and therefore that is a decision that could have criminal implications, and that they may have to answer for that. After that, in the subsequent 24 hours, we heard that 5, probably 12 people were killed, and were killed because we took the decision. We knew where they were, we knew they were there, we knew they were in trouble, we knew they were in distress, but refused to go for them. And therefore, in doing so, knowing that they're there and refusing to go there, I think it can be reasonably argued that we were part of their death, and that there are responsibilities there. And we've asked the police to investigate that. The decisions were taken at the very highest level. It's clear this wasn't, some rogue decision from somewhere. The Prime Minister took the decision. The Chief of the Army took the decision not to send and to dispatch the resources available to him in order to save lives. And we've asked the police to look into that. We've asked the police also to look into another incident, which did not result in death, but certainly could have. And that was the incident which allegedly happened. The government has not properly denied yet that it has happened, but it's been in the world newspapers for several days. The New York Times, The Guardian reported it. It was that incident where apparently a boatload of passengers was boarded by a crew member or crew members of our P-52 patrol boat, and their motorboat was sabotaged. And therefore,
why would they have sabotaged the boat? Why would the Maltese army have an interest in sabotaging the boat?
I absolutely cannot speak for anyone who might have done that or to give a reason that would rationalize it, but I can say that that we know of this from phone calls made from the boat, from passengers to an NGO that monitors these situations. And they said the soldier or soldiers who did this told them, we don't want you in Malta. So that may, if you like, explain.
Presumably to avoid them reaching the Maltese territorial waters. So this would have
yes, but the consequences far much further reaching than that. I mean, it is a situation where, in order to prevent someone from coming to Malta, you bring about their death, or you accelerate their death. As it turned out, I suspect, out of an appreciation here in Malta of the implications of this decision, the government made an exception for its own very categorical statement that it would not allow people coming from North Africa into Malta by going out for them, and indeed they were brought in, and they're in quarantine right now. So that turned out well, but it turned out very ugly.
So I think this question of whether this boat was sabotaged also calls into question the argument of the government that it's got no resources in terms of the AFM, right? If the AFM was being sent out to sabotage boats, then
I suppose yes, but there are questions that need to be asked first. I mean, when this sort of thing happens, let's say this was a rogue initiative of some soldier who certainly does not represent the sacrifice that the armed forces of Malta over 20 years has made, and the effort it has made to help people in distress at sea, to save people at sea. So this is not in character at all, not consistent with what the armed forces normally does, and therefore it needs to be looked into. It cannot just be covered up. And we hope that there are no consequences because we've brought them in, and therefore we do not sit down and say, listen, what happened here? How was this decision taken? Has someone, perhaps under the pressure of the moment, perhaps because of the pandemic, perhaps because of all the talk and the fear of disease, has someone done something very, very wrong here that could have had very serious consequences? And we've asked the police to look into it, which is
So you're not taking the Maltese government to court at an EU level or at an international level. You're simply making a request for a police investigation.
That's what we've done so far. There are other considerations that need to be studied, and they need to be studied carefully because there are many levels of this. For example, take the government's decision to shut down its harbours. Such a decision is the sovereign right of the Maltese government. There is no law anywhere in the world and no court anywhere in the world that can overrule a decision of a government to decide to close its ports. But that decision has been taken as grounds now for abdicating Malta's legal responsibilities to save people it knows are in distress at sea. The fact is, one does not have anything to do with the other. The obligation to save people remains. So let's say, for example, within Malta now on our land, on our territory, between ourselves, it is perfectly reasonable for the government to institute rules that say there's a medical emergency, so these things are going to happen, but it doesn't remove the obligation of the state to save someone in a traffic accident, for example, or having a heart attack.
What is your intended outcome from this police complaint? What do you hope to achieve by it?
A couple of words. Maltese Republic are, along with many other campaigners, are known for truth and justice. What really happened? And if an illegal decision was taken, whoever took it must assume responsibility for it. If the decision was criminal, then responsibility must be assumed for it. Simple as that.
And how do you respond to those people who say that your actions are unpatriotic, for example?
Very simply, really. If we live in a fatherland, in a patria that we love, surely we want the rights of every one of us to be respected. If we live here, we surely want not to be afraid that our rights are done away with. Now, if we allow the government of our fatherland, the fatherland is permanent, Malta is always there, the government is temporary. We give them power to take care of us. But if we allow them to ignore the rules and to let people die, today they're letting people you may not care about, black people at sea. You don't know their names, you've never seen them, you don't want them here, so you don't care if they're killed. Someone, and we're taking that job, has to point it out, that if they do it to them, tomorrow they can do it to you. So I think it is essentially patriotic that we not only praise our fatherland, which is fine, but take care of the people who live in it. And the people who look at Malta as that city on the hill or that land in the middle of the water, a land of hope. People who were trying to get here were looking at Malta as an opportunity to live rather than die. And instead we let them sink.
Do you accept any of the government's arguments, though? For example, the government is saying, you know, our medical and our security forces are under strain because of COVID-19 right now, and almost every kind of decision, you know, and there are even sort of health things that are being postponed to focus on this. On this reality, right? Does that make any sense to you as an argument that we cannot continue to be dedicating so much resources to what is probably going to end up being a record year in terms of boat arrivals?
To a point, is it ever justified that when we can save someone, we let them die in case we get too busy with COVID-19? No, as the 350 doctors signed a letter to the Prime Minister telling him we have an obligation as doctors to save lives. Doesn't matter if they're black or white or if they came from Africa, were born in Bubarad. It does not matter. We should not have to choose between saving lives drowning at sea and saving lives because there may be contagion from COVID-19. Now, obviously, there are sensible things you must do to prevent the two things from coming into each other. So if someone is coming from a rescue boat or if someone is coming from a repatriation flight, they both need to be quarantined. You still need to take measures to make sure that it doesn't result in an exacerbation of the pandemic. That's perfectly understandable. But taking that to the extent of saying it is better to let 12 people drown at sea than to risk any of them having COVID-19. That's absurd. That's like arguing, let's take old people's homes and burn them down with the people inside, because some of them
it's not the only thing it's not the only part of the argument, right? The other argument is, you know, our security forces are stretched with the enforcement of COVID-19. So it's not just saving one person not to save another, right?
If we're asked,
and the point of how heavy this is in terms of how it is likely to develop over the next few months. I mean, we already had a record year in the first few months of the year, and typically these migrant crossings happen in summer more.
Let's take those arguments one at a time.
Right. So the argument that our forces are going to be strained and you know, how do you reconcile that?
Let's make that argument. Take those. Let's start with the first one. Strained resources of the security forces. Again, the question here is, because I was using the medical argument first, which is often used. The argument about security is, must we choose between the jobs that the security forces are being asked to do now and saving lives at sea? It's the same dilemma that the Minister for Police was confronted with when they decided to open the hunting season. He was told, listen, if you're saying our security resources are stretched, how are you letting hunters hunt and no one is policing them? And the answer of the Minister Camilleri was, listen, don't worry, we can handle it. We can take it in our stride. Now, we can take that in our stride, and so should we, and anything the state can afford to police should be allowed to continue. We shouldn't shut down banks because we don't have enough police on money laundering. We don't, in fact. We shouldn't shut down hunting because we don't have enough police to chase them. We don't. But what we do shut down is saving people at sea. To me, it seems that the only real unspoken justification is that there is massive racial prejudice in this country, massive racial hatred, and an opportunity has been found to please the collective resentment that there is. They're black, let them drown. This is not an argument that the government can use, but it's the argument that is persuading the government to act in the way it is. And a word of warning on matters of policy to the government, COVID-19 will not be forever. I have yet to watch how they're going to handle all the people. What I think it was your estimate that some 80% of the population support this policy of the government. How they're going to handle their views when COVID-19 is over and we start saving people at sea again and bringing them in. Because people who want them to drown are not worried about COVID-19. People who want them to drown always wanted them to drown.
And I think it's, and we'll speak with Father Brendan about this as well. I think one of the most horrific elements of this is the reaction that some people had, right? Actually celebrating or laughing at the drownings. But before we get Father Brendan on, can you also respond to another sentiment? So you mentioned, okay, the racist sentiment that is sort of giving, I guess, the government a bit more confidence with acting potentially very illegally in terms of not rescuing migrants at sea. But there's also the other argument, right, of European solidarity. So there is a sentiment in Malta that is being fanned by the government in a big way, that the EU has let us down and has left Malta alone, left Malta and Italy alone. And Italy also makes this argument. Do you agree with that? I'm sure you don't agree that human lives should be used to negotiate or to make this point. But ultimately, this point, is it a valid one?
Okay, so you're sure I don't agree that human lives should be used as bargaining chips. And they are. So I think we need to really stop and think about that.
Yeah.
But on the second point, if we were ever to take it to take it to argument, I find two things. One is that dealing with the reality of migration not over the last 3 weeks because we've had COVID, but over the last 20 years has been a European failure, is a European failure. Malta, as a European country, is part of that failure. By saying we're not the only ones failing at this doesn't improve our record in any way. But certainly it is the case that Europe has refused to look at its southern border. It's also a fact that right-wing parties all over Europe, including our government, tend to blame failures of their responsibilities on the European Union. It's the easiest debate in the world. There's this argument that was being mixed up about not saving the people at sea because the EU failed. I need to try to understand what people expected the EU to do. Let's say a boat, a passenger ferry, is sinking in the Baltic Sea just outside Latvia. Can we be accused of failing if we don't send our patrol boat all the way through the Atlantic into the Baltic Sea to save them? It is clear these people are drowning in our waters. By telling the Danish that they've done nothing about it, it does not absolve us of our unique responsibility, or rather a responsibility we share with Italy. And I point out that we acted against Italy in the European Court of Human Rights as Repubblica this week as well. By going in our waters and save the people that are in our responsibility. When they are in our shores, yes, there is a reasonable criticism that not all European member states have lived up to the obligation of sharing that burden. Mm-hmm. Hungary is run by a dictatorship today, a fascist dictatorship. Poland is almost there, and these people have closed their doors to repatriations, but other countries in situations similar as this have taken on migrants saved up by Malta, and they've been repatriated to the EU. This happens all the time, and there would have been no reason to think that it wouldn't have happened. But the government preferred to pander to the racist prejudices of people and make a listen, and I want to illustrate this because we missed this argument in our discussion. There's something the government did or did not do that caused the death of 12. But the fate of the other 47 on the same boat is important as well. They were picked up by a Libyan ship and taken back to Libya. Now, it is not clear who instructed that ship to behave this way. There are some suspicions that actually it was the Maltese government that did that. That is pushback. That is sending people to the hell that Evarist Bartolo, and I would have pointed it out if he was here today, works so dramatically in describing the hell, and rightly so, the hell that it could be.
Violence and the torture and the horrific treatment in detention centers in Libya.
If we push them back there, and if that's what we did, not by taking our own patrol boat now and sending it to Libya, but by outsourcing it, getting a private vessel with a Libyan flag and have it do it for us. Mm-hmm. That is a breach of the same laws that we tried to breach as Malta. In the beginning of the Joseph Muscat government, when July 2013, the European Court of Human Rights intervened to stop us. Remember the pushback in 2013?
Which Joseph Muscat himself later on said was one of his mistakes, right? One of the that he regrets.
Yes, and because he pandered for the applause that day, and then he was stopped by law. Now, this time we tried to be smart. Instead of us setting fire to a house with people inside, we got someone else to do it for us. And now we're not breaking the law anymore. There is a serious moral failure here. We've sent 47 people to something that our own foreign minister describes as hell. We've let 12 people die while they waited for the same boat to take them to hell. And we are doing so, and this is really insidious, we are doing so in a way that we think we can avoid any legal consequence. Now, maybe they will avoid legal consequence, but we're going to study hard to see if that is the case or not, if we can make them face legal consequences.
I just want a quick clarification, because you mentioned the European Court of Human Rights in terms of Italy before, but before that,
I didn't mention that action. Yes, it's true.
Complaint. What is it? What is it? A case in the CHR, or is it a case in Malta with the police complaint?
Okay, no. So the complaints that we did are with the police commissioner. Another initiative that we took before, when the people were still in the boats outside, and we were trying to find ways of prioritizing before finding whose guilt it is to do what they did wrong. Let's try to save these people. So we went to the European Court of Human Rights and asked the European Court of Human Rights to issue an interim measure on the governments of Malta and Italy, saying, listen, there are people out at sea, they have a responsibility to go pick them up, they have an obligation under the convention to protect human life wherever they were born, and they're not doing it. Now, in the meantime, what happened was that these 4 boats in particular all met their fate, the last boat including deaths at sea. But we understand that Malta cannot be alone in this. Of course we understand. But in order to really decide where our loyalties need to lie, we shouldn't take a partisan attitude of saying Malta is always right, Malta right or wrong. That's not how you protect human life. Human lives first. The obligation to save them first. The closest person that can get to them. The safest place they can be taken to. Those are the considerations that need to be taken into account. Instead, we have this rush of very dangerous, proto-fascistic flag hugging that is going on. That is really exiling any contrary view. Anyone saying save a life, the answer that comes to it is not yes, is, but are they Maltese?
Okay.
Are they white?
Thank you very much. I want to bring in Father Brendan, and we'll continue the conversation, the 3 of us. I must say the resemblance is uncanny.
Perhaps apart from investigating what our fathers have been up to, we should clarify that officially we're not brothers.
Yes, and also putting a rest to the conspiracy theory that you're one person. Father Brendan, more seriously, yesterday you gave a homily which made some waves, right? You were celebrating Mass for the 30th monthly anniversary of since Daphne Caruana Galicia's assassination, which we'll be speaking to Manuel about as well. But you made a link between, I think, the Maltese public's reaction to the 12 migrants who lost their lives and the assassinated journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia. Talk to us a bit. Give us a summary of what you said in your homily and why you decided to make that statement.
Basically, obviously, my point wasn't, I mean, I don't speak on the political level. I don't speak as a politician. I speak as a priest. And the occasion was what it was. And the fact that we are in Easter week. So my starting point, my springboard was the idea that this is the season of hope. And hope on so many different levels, obviously. So hoping that soon the COVID situation will improve, hoping that, and the idea was that so many people have been expressing so much solidarity for each other over these days, but then it seems to stop at a certain level. And the idea I took, the gist of the homily was that following the assassination, the death of Daphne Caruana Galizia 30 months ago, I was hoping personally, and I think many people also hoped on all sides of the political spectrum, I would imagine, that it was a bit of a wake-up call in the sense that we can disagree with each other on so many different issues, but then we can still discuss respectfully, we can still discuss issues rather than attacks on the person. You know, if people start saying now, if they disagree with me, but they say I should go on a diet, which presumably someone will, because I was reading the comments beforehand, it does not make me wrong or right in what I'm saying, and it does not make them right or wrong in what they're saying either. So instead of having ad hominem attacks against persons, I would hope that we could grow in having a mature discussion about issues without being blinkered by political ideas. Anyway, so the point was that I was hoping, and so many people were hoping, that the death of Daphne Caruana Galizia could be a wake-up call for all of us to try and mature. And I mentioned many different issues in my homily. Our reliance on money to the extent that we make money into a god, and so there were many different issues. But then, so there are certain hopes that are kindled that the situation might improve. And then, as you see in the discourse going on in these last few weeks, especially these last few days, the hopes seem to get dashed once again, because the same kind of attitudes, either hateful and celebrating in the same way that some people were actually celebrating Daphne's death 30 months ago. We saw people actually putting smiley emojis, smiley faces under the news that boats had overturned, people had drowned. And by the way, this was not just these last few days, because whenever there is a tragedy like that at sea, you do see these kinds of reactions. Apart from the fact that it's not just those kinds of people who scare me, that they would rejoice that someone would drown. And by the way, even if, because then people tried to debunk that news and saying, yes, no one really drowned. But for the moment when people were actually putting smiley faces, the news had not been debunked. So whether they drowned or not, or whether they died of dehydration and thirst and hunger, they still died, and we indirectly had a hand in that. That's what I would say.
What do you think? What's causing this? As in, you said you hoped that Daphne's murder would change that sentiment, But in actual fact, it seems to have had the opposite impact. The sort of comments, I mean, even some of the comments that we're seeing now to this conversation, it kind of makes you wonder, where is all this hatred coming from? Where is all this anger coming from? Do you think it's a question of socioeconomics, for example? Do you think it's a question of people being afraid of their jobs, or even more so in this in this post-COVID situation, or is it a question of our politics in the way that the rhetoric that politicians use? I mean, surely it feels a little bit disheartening as a priest and as a member of the church to hear some of the reactions. On the one hand, you have this absolute fanaticism towards anything like the Festi and the patron saints and the church, etc. And then as soon as the church makes a very obvious kind of comment, which is like, let's not let people drown at sea just to prove a point to Europe, you get labeled traitors and nationalists and all of these things. What's triggering it, and how does it feel?
I think that obviously the examination of this whole issue would have to be on so many different levels. I think that, yes, we do depart from a very tribal attitude towards everything. And I think that many of us, we grew up sort of getting our news and our interpretations of news and what things are, what's happening around us through a filter of the political tribe that we belong to. And I don't just mean the party, because sometimes supporters of a political party might go beyond what the party itself. So there's like a tribe, and everything you get to know and everything you understand about life is filtered through that. And as you correctly pointed out, it's not just on the political level, because as a church, we also struggle regularly with the idea of the tribal attitudes towards feasts, for example, especially parishes where there are 2 or more different feasts and they're competing. And it's easy to play it down as a kind of playful rivalry, but sometimes you get real hatred coming across in different areas, and even real theological manipulation, in the sense of people actually looking down on a particular saint or looking down on a particular event in the church's history simply because it's associated with the other festivity. So that's definitely one of the aspects we need to consider. But secondly, I don't think it's just something which belongs to a particular socio-economic background, because in fact in my homily yesterday, then I made a second point. It's not just the trolls, it's not just the people who put smiley faces on their horrible news that scare me, but also regular people very much like ourselves, I would say, in the sense that there's a big chunk of people who are in the middle, somewhere between the sort of the far left and the far right, kind of. But even in some of these aspects, and I admit over the years I've had to struggle myself with these things, about, for instance, how do we discuss these kinds of issues that have been that you've been discussing with Manuel as well. So, for example, when people start applying a logic like if we accept them, it means that we are enabling the scaphisti, the people smugglers, and all these things. But the reality, I try to bring things to a very basic level, and I was thinking, if someone abandons an infant, a 1-year-old or 2-year-old child outside my door today, and I live on a very trafficky street, so there's cars passing all the time. And it might be an unfit mother, it might be someone who has kidnapped that child or something like that. If they abandon that child in front of my door, I have no legal obligation to go and save that child. But my moral obligation, especially if I consider myself both on the level of humanity and also on the level of Christianity, I have a moral obligation to go and save that child, lest he or she be run over by a car. Mm-hmm. So the idea that just because someone else brought them over, just because someone else might be encouraging them to make this very perilous crossing, it does not absolve me personally of my moral obligations. And also, apart from the fact that we have a search and rescue area, which means that we also have legal obligations to the international community. So I'm very scared of not just of the trolls, of the people who are on the extremes, but also of the moderate people who start taking on this kind of mentality as well, because it's definitely not a Christian mentality. It's not a human mentality, because I have no, I mean, the church and Christianity has no monopoly on what should be a humane understanding of life and humane behavior. So that was my whole gist yesterday.
I want to widen a bit the discussion now to a couple of other points. This program is intended to sort of analyze and discuss some of the very stark changes in our society brought about by COVID-19, both in the immediate and in the long term. So I want to start with you, Fr Brendan. Like when it comes to the church, I mean, the church has been hugely impacted by the measures that have been taken so far to control the pandemic, right? So, for example, mass has been prohibited in public gatherings, funerals, weddings, so many other the festi themselves in summer. So many things have been cancelled and have had to change. How are you dealing with that as a priest yourself? It must be quite difficult to miss your congregation as well.
Yes,
there's also been some interesting developments in terms of shifting things online, right? Tell us a bit about the response that you're seeing.
So I think on the personal level, yes, it is heartbreaking in the sense that, for example, when we stopped having public masses, for example, I help out. I live in Malta, but I help out in Msida. So I know that probably some of my regular 8 o'clock in the morning congregation especially the elderly and those who are in very poor health, when I go back to celebrating, whenever that might be, so it might be a question of weeks or months, I might not see some of them ever again because some of them might have passed away. And it's heartbreaking, not just for the pastors, but especially obviously for the families. We've had people who are very close to the church, but the families could not grieve properly because a moment of a funeral, whether you believe or not, but it's always a moment when people come together and you can reflect on the life of that person and also hopefully give some hope and some sense of purpose to the life of that person. So obviously we've lost a lot of that. So that's all very sad. But I think as a church, it's also been a positive moment in the sense, I can't say that we've been proactive because some of these things should have been done much earlier. But there's a positive sense of reaction that we've been pushed out of the churches, but very much present online now. To mention the masses taking place, especially the last days of Lent, we had Lenten talks, esercizi taking place online as well. So it's certainly pushed us very much out of a comfort zone because
it's something that will be continued later in the sense.
I definitely hope so. Yes, even if
as in, I asked this, on behalf of perhaps very practicing Catholics, in the future. Is it kind of excusable, so to speak, to not go physically to church but to enjoy mass from the comfort of home, or does that not fully count?
No, I mean it's a very interesting question because I was discussing it with some priest friends of mine, and we were actually saying that if the situation is resolved in a decent time, sort of in a few weeks, perhaps we can go back to our churches, we might see a bit of a resurgence because people have actually been feeling the need for that. And bear in mind that we were affected in one of the best moments of our liturgical life because, as we know, Our Lady of Sorrows, Dolori, Good Friday, Easter Sunday, they're all very powerful moments in the life of the church. And people, even those who don't really practice that much, but they do love to come to church around that time. So possibly if the situation is resolved within a few weeks, we might see a good resurgence even of people who've missed the church and they feel they come back a bit even just out of nostalgia. But I think there's also a danger of people getting used to it. So there might be a few people who might say, I don't need to go back physically to the church because my needs are still being met. So it's always going to be, but I think on the whole, many people are expressing a desire to actually go back, even the sense of community. I wrote a little note on Facebook when we actually had to close down our churches, and I told the people in my congregation on a typical Sunday that I was going to miss them, and I look forward to the day when we can shake hands and hug each other. And I think we're not going to become all of a sudden immune to physical contact and the joy of being together as a community.
I'll ask you a bit later as well about the financial impact of donations, but I want to start with Manuel. We don't have much more time, but so as briefly as possible. Yesterday was an important anniversary in terms of the campaign for justice and truth in the murder of Daphne Caruana Galizia. You weren't able to celebrate or commemorate that in person, right? Or with all the supporters of that cause. How did you respond to it instead? What are you doing in terms of the activism on that front? And how much is there a financial strain going on because of that?
Well, in the month that we've been locked inside, or rather prevented from gathering, the thing we've missed most is our monthly gathering, which is not a religious event by any stretch, but it certainly has the same characteristics of a feeling of community and solidarity between people who share a cause and who share a hope. And it was always very important for us to be together, and it kept the cause and the issue alive when everyone was looking away, until there came a point at the end of last year when everyone came around us, as it were. So we would have been the usual 300-400, and we became 20,000. And I think the presence in the street is very important because we raise awareness, we have a message. It's not an issue of a personal opinion. It doesn't make you more right in numbers, but it certainly makes you feel like it's worth passing the message if you have the opportunity to stand tall in a square and say, this is what I stand for. So we miss that, and we've tried to make up for it, and we try to make up for it with online virtual vigils and gatherings. And I have to say, one thing that touched me is getting messages yesterday by people who tell me, I do not have a Facebook account, which is not a set of words you hear very often these days. You might have heard that 10 years ago. I do not have a Facebook account. How can I follow Father Brendan's Mass? How can I join you in your memorial for Daphne this evening? And between us, activists in Republic and Occupy Justice, we got dozens of these messages. And we helped people for the first time actually participate, because for them, the cause was more important than the inability to show up and stand for it.
What about donations, Manuel? I know that obviously what you do costs a lot of money in terms of setting up these events and things like that, and banners, etc. And I believe NGOs in general are struggling to raise funds in these times. Are you experiencing that as well?
Yes, look, there is certainly an impact. It's not that people are less generous or less minded for the cause, but there are even normal, natural barriers that people who will tell you, I have never had a Facebook account, will also tell you I don't have a PayPal account, or I don't know how I can contribute, because normally I put money in the bucket, as it were.
And there's less disposable income as well, right?
And there is that. Certainly there is that. I mean, in reality, is either less disposable income for people who have been financially impacted by the situation, or merely the fear that they would be impacted financially, because we don't know the world we're going to wake up to. From what we feel is not going to be as easy as it was before we got into this. And therefore people, yes, hold on to their money a bit more. So yes, there is that. I think more seriously is not an impact that this may have on organizations like ours. I mean, one way or another we'll make do. And normally what you really need is to invest time in this sort of activity, though money is important. But obviously, it's more worrying about organizations that are actually bridging the gap created by the hardship that COVID-19 creates. So people who are actually struggling to make ends meet, people who are struggling to find food to put on the table. And those are supported by NGOs, not ours, but others who do priceless silent work. Absolutely, that work depends on the time they give in it, but absolutely it depends on money that people give. So if I were to ask people that in the middle of all the crackle and noise that there is about COVID-19, to remember to help out and to remember to give, certainly their top priority needs to be those NGOs that provide food banks, that provide support, that provide the most vulnerable people in our community who fall between the cracks, inevitably.
Thank you very much, Manuel. And to conclude with you, Father Brendan, I imagine the church is one such organization, right, that does a lot of work for the most vulnerable in our society. But as we know, as far as I know, a large part of the donations towards the church happen at Mass, with
of course, yes,
with the office that's taken around physically. So that must have had a big impact on the church as well, right? Can you just
definitely
about that, and we'll conclude.
Yes, and in fact, I think we have been very focused. I'm not a parish priest myself. I'm not a capellan or an archpriest, but I have a lot of contact with my friends who are, and they were mentioning that they're seeing these kinds of issues now because it's not just now the festas are out of the question. So thankfully, you don't have to do the collection for that. It's whether people describe it as burning money literally up in the air or whatever, but it's also a traditional thing. But also because there are people who are homeless, for example, regularly in Msida, I had homeless people coming over, and we would help them in one way or another, even sometimes by putting them in touch with a social worker that we know to be able to guide them and get them back on their feet. And unfortunately, that's also not happening. I think if people really want to, for example, even with a prayer group, which I chaplain, we dug into some of the savings of the group to be able to help out the food bank, which we had heard was not in a good position. So I think that, God willing, people will also feel the need to somehow help, especially those which are the most pressing needs. Festas, God willing, will come again in the future. They might be a little different than what we know, but the real needs of actual people who are bleeding and sick and hungry, those we need to care for them, because that is part and parcel of our DNA, and not just as human beings, but then especially as Christians.
Thank you very, very much, Father Brendan and Manuel Delia, for joining COVID Calls. I'll just give a little conclusion at the end. So thank you very much for being.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, so that was another edition of COVID Calls. Just to clarify again, today's edition was meant to feature Foreign Affairs Minister Evarist Bartolo, who had to cancel his appearance. We have been assured that he will be available to do a call tomorrow, so hopefully we'll get to talk about the humanitarian situation in the Mediterranean Sea with Minister Bartolo tomorrow. But today's edition was also broadened into the issues of activism and the church in terms of COVID-19. And we had some very interesting points, both from Father Brendan about how the church is starting to migrate more online due to this pandemic, and is also trying to deal with so much slowdown of weddings and funerals and festi and other things which kept the communities very much together. And similarly, in the case of Republica and Occupy Justice and other activist groups, something that previously was a big element of community and commemorating events together, such as yesterday's monthly vigil on the 16th for the assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia. Those things have also had to stop and be migrated to some degree online. So thank you very much for watching COVID Calls again. Hopefully we'll be with you tomorrow with an interview with Evarist Bartolo, Minister of Foreign Affairs. And in the meantime, have a great week, and thanks for following COVID Calls.